The early morning sunlight draped across Pinewood Estates, a quiet suburban enclave where every lawn looked cloned from a brochure, trimmed, leveled, and suspiciously perfect. Birds chirped from the sycamore trees that lined the curved streets, their branches bending gently in the breeze. The sound of a sprinkler system clicked rhythmically, like a neighborhood heartbeat. At house number 43, however, something had changed. A pristine white fence stood freshly installed, its wood gleaming against the green grass. To most, it looked harmless, even tasteful. But to Karen Whitmore, it was a declaration of war. She spotted it from across the cul-de-sac as she fetched her morning newspaper. Her eyes narrowed behind her oversized sunglasses, and she muttered to herself, Section 8B, Unauthorized Modifications. Not on my watch. Clutching her clipboard like a badge of authority, Karen marched down the sidewalk in her beige pumps, every step sharp and decisive. Her posture was stiff, her expression carved from permanent disapproval. The neighbors who saw her knew better than to say good morning. Karen didn't do mornings, she did enforcement. By the time she reached the edge of Miriam Blackwood's property, she was already scribbling on a citation slip, lips pursed in self-satisfaction. She admired the fence for a moment, then sniffed disdainfully. No approval form submitted, color not compliant, spacing incorrect, she muttered, ticking boxes. Violations everywhere. Inside the yard, Miriam Blackwood was on her knees beside a flower bed, her hair pulled into a loose bun, gardening gloves streaked with soil. She was humming softly, an old jazz tune, one she played when she wanted to clear her head. The faint smell of lavender and damp earth surrounded her. The fence behind her wasn't a statement, it was simply a boundary, privacy she had longed for after years of working under public scrutiny. When she heard the sharp ahem from the sidewalk, she turned her head and smiled politely, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Good morning," she said with a calmness that only irritated Karen further. Karen didn't return the smile. "Mrs. or Miss Blackwood, is it? I'm the president of the Pinewood Homeowners Association, and I'm afraid you've already violated community regulations." She flipped her clipboard dramatically, revealing a printed rule sheet with fluorescent sticky notes. "This fence doesn't comply with HOA Section 8B, subsection 2. You need prior approval before construction. Frankly, this is a serious offense." Miriam rose slowly, taking her time, and faced Karen over the white panels. Her gaze was gentle but firm, the kind that didn't flinch easily. "I wasn't aware a simple fence could be a serious offense," she replied softly. Her voice carried an authority that Karen couldn't quite place, something composed yet commanding. "But I'll be happy to review the rules." Karen's nostrils flared. "Don't play coy with me. Everyone gets the same handbook when they move in. Around here, we follow structure, discipline, and order. If you don't fix this by Monday, I'll have to issue a fine and possibly involve the county inspectors." She paused, lowering her voice with theatrical malice. "You might even face a lien on your property. I've done it before." Miriam tilted her head slightly. "A lien for a fence," she said, almost amused. "You must be very dedicated to your job." Karen smirked, mistaking sarcasm for fear. "Dedicated? No. Responsible. I protect this neighborhood from chaos. One small violation becomes a trend, and soon everyone's painting fences and parking RVs on lawns. I won't allow Pinewood Estates to look like a junkyard." A faint breeze stirred Miriam's hair as she replied, "I assure you, Karen, I value order as much as you do." She wiped her gloves on a cloth and gestured toward the house. "Why don't we sit and discuss this over some coffee? You can show me the section you mentioned." Karen bristled, taken aback by the invitation. "Coffee? I don't have time for chit-chat. You either comply or face the consequences." She took a step closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "I have connections at the county office. It'd be a shame if your property ran into legal trouble." That line hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Miriam's eyes met Karen's, calm, unblinking, unreadable. "Legal trouble," she repeated softly. Then, after a pause, she smiled faintly. "That would be interesting." Karen, confident in her authority, snapped her clipboard shut and turned on her heel. "Monday. Fix it, or I'll fix it for you." Her heels clicked against the pavement as she strutted back toward her SUV, self-assured and righteous. The vehicle's engine roared to life, and she sped off, leaving behind a faint trail of dust and the scent of cheap perfume. For a long moment, the only sounds were the whisper of wind and the trickle of water from Miriam's garden hose. David Blackwood, her husband, stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand. He had been watching from the window, quiet and observant. "She really just threatened you?" he asked, incredulous. Miriam turned to him with a small, wry smile. "Oh, David, that wasn't a threat. That was a warning shot." She leaned her shovel against the fence and dusted her hands. "She's exactly what I expected to find here." David frowned. "You think this will get worse?" "Undoubtedly," Miriam replied. Her gaze lingered on the direction Karen had driven away. The faintest flicker of something, amusement, perhaps anticipation, crossed her face. "But don't worry. Some people learn the easy way. Others," she trailed off, her tone sharpening slightly, "they learn in court." David chuckled under his breath, though he recognized that edge in her voice, the one that used to silence full courtrooms. "You promised you wouldn't bring work home, remember?" "I'm not bringing it home," she said, turning back to her flowers. "It's already here." The camera, or narrator's voice, if for video, would linger on the tranquil garden, the flowers, the fence, the calm before the inevitable storm, as the faint sound of Karen's SUV faded into the distance. The peaceful neighborhood shimmered under the morning sun, oblivious to the conflict brewing beneath its perfect lawns. And so began the quiet battle between Judge Miriam Blackwood and Karen Whitmore, the self-crowned queen of Pinewood Estates, a battle that would soon turn a suburban paradise into a courtroom of its own. The Pinewood Estates community hall was rarely this full. The long rectangular room buzzed with murmurs and nervous chatter as homeowners filed in, clutching their folded HOA notices like summonses. The fluorescent lights hummed above, illuminating the polished oak table at the center, the one where Karen Whitmore always sat, as if it were a throne. Her clipboard rested neatly before her, color-coded tabs peeking from its edges. A tiny American flag stood beside her glass of water, as though patriotism itself validated her authority. The faint smell of coffee, old paper, and cheap perfume mixed in the air. One could sense that tonight, the usual monotony of budget discussions and lawn maintenance rules would take a sharp turn. The newest name on the agenda, Miriam Blackwood, Lot 43. Karen cleared her throat sharply, signaling the beginning. "All right, everyone, let's maintain order," she began, her voice echoing through the room with practiced command. "We have several matters to discuss, but first, we'll be addressing an unapproved construction." She looked around, her eyes darting like a hawk scanning for prey. The homeowner at 43 Maple has installed a fence without submitting the proper design approval form. A blatant violation of Section 8B. She flipped a page for dramatic effect. "Accordingly, I propose a fine of $500 and a notice of correction within 5 business days." The board members, 5 in total, sat in a row beside her, most too timid to argue. They exchanged nervous glances, the kind of silent communication that said, "Here we go again." One of them, an older man named Paul, cleared his throat softly. "Karen, I thought, maybe we should confirm whether she actually had a permit before." Karen's glare cut him off mid-sentence. "Paul, we can't make exceptions. That's how rules start to crumble. I've already inspected the property myself." A younger woman on the board, Julia, looked uneasy. "But shouldn't we give her a chance to respond? I mean, she just moved in. Maybe she didn't know the process." Karen's lips tightened. "Ignorance of the law isn't an excuse, Julia. We're protecting everyone's property value here. If we let her slide, we might as well invite anarchy." She adjusted her pearl necklace and sat back with satisfaction. "Now let's vote." But before she could raise her hand, the heavy wooden door at the back of the hall opened with a soft creak. The chatter died instantly. All eyes turned to see Miriam Blackwood walk in, calm and composed, a neat folder tucked under her arm. She wasn't dressed for confrontation, just a simple navy blue blazer over a white blouse, her posture straight and effortless. She walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking softly, and stopped near the table. "Good evening," she said in that smooth, balanced tone that somehow commanded the room without raising its volume. "I thought it would be best if I attended, since it seems my property is under discussion." Karen blinked in disbelief. This is a private board meeting. Homeowners don't just walk in uninvited. Miriam placed her folder gently on the table and met Karen's gaze. Actually, she said, flipping open the HOA handbook that she had brought with her, Section 3, subparagraph A, homeowners are entitled to attend board sessions when issues directly involving their property are being deliberated. I believe that would apply here, wouldn't it? There was a flicker of discomfort among the board members. Julia tried not to smile. Paul leaned forward to read the passage, nodding faintly. She's right, Karen. It's in there. Karen's face flushed pink, but she forced a tight smile. Fine. You may observe, Mrs. Blackwood. But this isn't a debate. Miriam's lips curved slightly. Oh, I'm not here to debate. I'm here to clarify. She opened her folder, pulling out a neatly stamped and dated sheet of paper. This, she said, holding it up so everyone could see, is my building permit, approved and signed by the county's zoning department. The same office you claimed to have connections in. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The silence in the room was already doing her work for her. Karen blinked rapidly, color draining from her face for a moment before she recovered. That doesn't matter. You still didn't file a design approval form with us. That's separate from county requirements. Miriam nodded. Yes, I reviewed that rule last night. But it also says here, she flipped to another section in the HOA charter, pages already highlighted, that the HOA cannot issue fines or penalties without written verification of the alleged violation and an opportunity for the homeowner to respond in writing within 7 days. She looked directly at Karen now, the faintest glint of amusement in her calm brown eyes. You posted a violation notice on my mailbox less than 24 hours ago. You're moving ahead with a fine before that response period. That, I believe, constitutes a procedural breach. A murmur rippled across the room. Someone in the back whispered, "She's quoting the bylaws better than the president." Paul coughed discreetly to hide a chuckle. Karen's jaw clenched. You can't just come in here lecturing us on policy. We've been running this community for years. I can see that, Miriam said lightly. And I'm sure you mean well. But I would advise that if you intend to enforce rules, you should first make sure you're following them. That line landed with precision. Julia bit her lip, trying not to laugh outright. Karen's knuckles whitened around her pen as she tried to reassert control. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped suddenly. We'll revisit this next week once we've reviewed the documents. Miriam calmly gathered her papers. That sounds reasonable, she said. Then, before leaving, she looked directly at Karen one last time. I understand your concern for community standards, Mrs. Whitmore. But you might want to be careful with threats of legal trouble. Not everyone here is who you assume they are. Karen's eyes narrowed, but before she could reply, Miriam turned and walked out, slow, deliberate, the way someone leaves a courtroom after delivering a final verdict. The door closed softly behind her, but the silence she left behind was deafening. The other board members avoided Karen's gaze, shuffling their papers or pretending to check their phones. The self-appointed queen of Pinewood Estates sat there, seething, her authority visibly cracking. After a few seconds, Paul leaned toward her and said quietly, Karen, maybe next time, we should verify before issuing fines. Karen snapped her head toward him. She humiliated me in front of the board, she hissed. She thinks she's clever. But I'll find out who she is, and when I do, she'll regret crossing me. Her pen scribbled furiously on her notes, the lines thick and angry. The meeting officially ended, but Karen didn't move. The once proud president now sat rigid in her chair, surrounded by silence and the faint echo of her own authority slipping away. Outside, through the tall windows, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hall. It was no longer the safe, predictable domain she ruled. Out in the parking lot, Miriam Blackwood paused beside her car. She watched the faint light inside the hall flicker before shutting off completely. The quiet hum of crickets filled the evening air. She glanced down at her folder, the papers neatly stacked, and whispered almost to herself, "You should have read the fine print, Karen." Then she got into her car and drove away, her taillights fading into the suburban darkness, the calm before the storm that was still gathering its force. The night had fallen heavy over Pinewood Estates. A soft drizzle misted the air, making the streetlights glow in hazy circles that reflected off the wet pavement. The quiet hum of crickets was broken only by the distant murmur of a TV through a neighbor's window. Most of the homes were dark now, curtains drawn, porches empty, except for one. At the end of the cul-de-sac, the Blackwood residence still glowed faintly from the kitchen lights. Inside, Miriam Blackwood sat by the counter, sipping tea, a stack of papers open beside her. She had that calm posture she always carried, the kind that said she was thinking 3 steps ahead, even when she appeared relaxed. Across from her, David read a book but kept stealing glances at her face. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" he asked quietly. Miriam smiled faintly without looking up. "She's the kind of person who can't sleep when she feels outsmarted. She'll do something impulsive." David sighed. "And you're just waiting for it." Miriam took another sip, the steam curling upward like smoke. "No," she said softly. "I'm prepared for it." At almost that exact moment, the sharp sound of tires on wet asphalt broke the peace outside. A set of headlights cut through the darkness, swinging wildly as a silver SUV came to a sudden stop in front of their driveway. The engine revved once, then shut off. For a brief moment, the only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine. Then the driver's door slammed open. Karen Whitmore stepped out, her pastel blazer replaced with a heavy coat thrown carelessly over a nightdress. Her hair was pulled back in a hasty bun, and in her hand she clutched her infamous clipboard, as if it were a weapon. The rain dotted her glasses, but she didn't seem to care. She stomped up the driveway, her heels sinking slightly into the damp gravel. From inside, David saw the figure approaching and frowned. "You were right," he murmured. "She's here." Miriam didn't seem surprised. She set down her cup gently and stood, her expression calm, almost serene. "Stay inside," she told him softly. Then she opened the front door. The cool night air rushed in as Karen's voice sliced through the darkness. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my board and get away with it?" she barked. Her tone was sharp, trembling with anger. "You made a mockery of me, of the HOA, of everything this community stands for." Her words echoed down the empty street, bouncing off the houses. Miriam stepped out onto the porch, a soft light illuminating her from behind. She didn't raise her voice. "Karen," she said evenly, "it's nearly 10 o'clock. You shouldn't be here." But Karen was beyond reason now. She marched closer, pointing her pen like a knife. "Don't you dare tell me where I should or shouldn't be. You think you're so clever, quoting bylaws and hiding behind paperwork. I know your type, arrogant, entitled, manipulative." She jabbed her pen toward the fence. "That thing right there. It's still a violation. You think a few fancy words can change that?" Miriam's gaze didn't waver. The rain had darkened her hair, tiny droplets clinging to the strands, but she stood still, unbothered. "You came all the way here in the rain to argue about a fence?" she asked softly. "This isn't about rules anymore, is it, Karen?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Karen let out a harsh laugh. "You think you're so superior. You think you can talk circles around me, make me look stupid in front of everyone. But I'll tell you something, Mrs. Blackwood," she sneered, stepping dangerously close. "People like me built this neighborhood. We made it respectable. You're just a guest here." Miriam tilted her head slightly, her tone still quiet. "A guest," she repeated. "That's interesting." Her eyes flicked briefly to the clipboard in Karen's hands. "You've spent so long policing this place that you've forgotten what it means to be a neighbor." Karen's face reddened. "Don't lecture me on morality. I enforce it." She stepped even closer until she was only a few feet away. "If you don't comply by Monday, I'll call every inspector, every zoning officer, every legal contact I have. You'll be buried in paperwork before you can blink." A faint smile ghosted across Miriam's face. "Paperwork," she murmured. "You must love it. Tell me, Karen, do you actually read the legal documents you wave around?" Karen scowled, rain dripping down her chin. "I don't need to read them to know when someone's breaking the rules." At that, Miriam's expression shifted. It wasn't anger or pity, it was something colder, more deliberate. She stepped down from the porch, standing now at Karen's level, her voice low but firm. "Then maybe you should start. Because if you did, you'd know that harassment and trespassing are violations too. And right now, you're committing both. Karen blinked, taken aback. Trespassing? I'm not. Before she could finish, another voice broke the tension. Ma'am, I think that's enough. Both women turned to see a figure emerging from the dark, Officer Daniels, the local sheriff's deputy. His patrol car idled at the end of the street, red and blue lights flickering faintly in the drizzle. He held his flashlight low, but his tone was firm. Got a call from one of your neighbors, he said, addressing Karen. Said someone was shouting in the street. Karen's face paled slightly, but she straightened her coat. Officer Daniels, thank goodness you're here. This woman has been breaking HOA rules and... Daniels held up a hand. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not here for HOA business. I'm here because you're on private property after hours, and you're disturbing the peace. Karen's jaw dropped. Disturbing the peace? I am the HOA President. Daniel's expression didn't change. That may be true, ma'am, but it doesn't give you the right to show up uninvited on someone's property at night. He turned to Miriam, softening slightly. Is everything all right here, Mrs. Blackwood? Miriam nodded. Everything's fine now, officer. Mrs. Whitmore was just leaving. Karen's mouth opened in protest. Leaving? But Daniels interrupted her. Ma'am, please. Go home. Let's not make this more complicated than it has to be. The rain picked up, spattering the ground in tiny ripples. For a long moment, Karen stood frozen, torn between fury and humiliation. Her knuckles whitened around the clipboard. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice cracking with emotion. You'll regret this. Both of you. Miriam's tone remained cool, almost gentle. That's a dangerous thing to say in front of a police officer. Karen's eyes darted toward Daniels, who was clearly noting every word. She swallowed hard, then spun on her heel and stormed back toward her SUV, her shoes splashing through puddles. The door slammed shut, and moments later, the headlights swept over them before the vehicle roared down the street, disappearing into the darkness. Officer Daniels lingered for a moment, glancing at Miriam with a curious expression. You handled that better than most, he said. She's been calling our office non-stop for years over the smallest things, mailboxes, garden gnomes, you name it. Miriam smiled faintly. Some people mistake control for purpose, she replied. Daniels nodded, then hesitated. If she keeps this up, you can file a restraining order. You know the procedure. Miriam's lips curved slightly, just enough for him to notice. Yes, officer, she said. I know it very well. For a second, Daniels studied her face, something clicking in his mind. Wait a minute, he said slowly. Blackwood. Judge Miriam Blackwood. Karen's name still echoed in the air, but now it was Officer Daniels' voice that carried weight. Miriam didn't deny it. She simply gave a calm nod. Retired, she said. But yes, once upon a time. Daniels exhaled through his nose, an amused smile tugging at his lips. Well, that explains a lot. Miriam chuckled softly. Have a good night, officer. When he finally left, the street grew silent again. Miriam stood for a while under the drizzle, watching the raindrops slide down the fence, the very one that had sparked the feud. Inside, David appeared at the doorway, worry etched across his face. Everything okay? Miriam looked back at him and smiled. It will be, she said quietly. I think it's time Karen learned the difference between a neighborhood rule and the law. As she stepped back inside, the camera, or narrative lens, would linger on the glistening fence, the raindrops tracing paths down the white wood like tiny signatures of defiance. The neighborhood was quiet once more, but beneath its manicured lawns and polished facades, the balance of power had just shifted, and Karen Whitmore, for the first time in years, was no longer in control. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Pinewood Estates community hall, illuminating rows of folding chairs and the long, polished table at the front. The usual chatter that preceded every HOA meeting was missing today. Instead, a nervous silence hung in the air. Board members shuffled papers unnecessarily, avoiding eye contact, while a few homeowners whispered among themselves. Karen Whitmore sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her fingers tapping against her coffee mug in an impatient rhythm. She'd called this special session to reassert her dominance after last night's humiliating confrontation, determined to make an example of the new neighbor who had dared to challenge her rule. Her pink blazer was crisp as ever, but the edges of her confidence were fraying, and beneath the flawless appearance, she could feel a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: unease. When Miriam Blackwood entered the hall, the air shifted. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't have to. Dressed in a tailored navy coat, calm and unhurried, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone used to standing in rooms where decisions changed lives. David followed a few steps behind her, holding a slim black case that he placed neatly on the table. The sound of the latch clicking open echoed in the quiet hall, drawing every eye. Karen forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood," she began, the edge of condescension sharpening her tone, "this is an HOA board meeting, not a courtroom. I don't know what you think you're doing here, but we have procedures." Miriam met her gaze evenly, her voice calm and low. "I'm aware of procedures, Mrs. Whitmore. In fact, I'm quite familiar with them. You've accused me publicly of violating HOA bylaws, and you filed 3 separate complaints with the county inspector's office. Each one unfounded. I thought it best to clarify matters before your board, officially." She opened the folder David had handed her, revealing neatly organized documents, stamped and notarized. "These are county permits for the fencing and garden modifications, approved before construction began. And this," she added, sliding another sheet across the table, "is the official notice from the county verifying that no code violations exist on my property." The papers landed softly, but the silence afterward was deafening. Karen's forced smile faltered for a split second, then she straightened, trying to regain control. "That doesn't change the fact that you bypassed HOA review. We have our own standards, Mrs. Blackwood. You can't just—" "Actually," Miriam interrupted gently, "I can. The HOA's Architectural Committee must operate under state housing guidelines. According to Section 14C of your own charter, once a homeowner receives county-level approval, HOA review is considered redundant, unless evidence of misconduct exists." "Which it doesn't." Her tone wasn't aggressive, but firm enough that several board members shifted uncomfortably. Karen's cheeks colored. "You seem very confident for someone who just moved in," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you have a law degree hiding somewhere too?" Miriam smiled faintly. "Something like that." She reached into her case once more and withdrew a small leather folder. With a quiet click, she opened it and placed it on the table. The gold seal of the State Judicial Commission gleamed beneath the lights. The room collectively drew a breath as she said, in the same calm tone, "I'm Judge Miriam Blackwood, District Court. I specialize in property disputes and municipal code enforcement." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, the quiet murmuring began, stunned whispers rippling through the board. Karen's face went pale, her mouth parting slightly as if the air itself had turned against her. "Judge," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Miriam nodded, her eyes fixed on Karen's trembling hands. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Which means every report you filed, every complaint you exaggerated, and every false fine you attempted to impose is now part of a public record, one I've already submitted for review. You've used your HOA position to harass residents and misuse authority. That won't continue." Karen tried to speak, but her voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. You set me up," she hissed. Miriam shook her head slowly. "No. You set yourself up, Karen. I simply followed the law, something you should have done before threatening people." She turned to the rest of the board, her tone softening. "I'm not here to dismantle this HOA. A community needs structure. But what it doesn't need is abuse of power disguised as leadership." Across the room, several board members nodded in agreement. One of them, a middle-aged man named Tom, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, with all due respect, we didn't know you were sending personal complaints to the county. That's not standard protocol." Karen's head whipped toward him. "You're all going to turn on me now? After everything I've done to keep this place in order?" she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual force. Her control, once absolute, was slipping with every word. Officer Daniels, who had been quietly standing at the back of the room to ensure peace, stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said evenly, "the county's already investigating your misuse of HOA funds. I'd suggest you cooperate fully." The collective gasp that followed struck like thunder. Karen's hands trembled. "This is absurd. I built this neighborhood. I made it safe." Miriam met her gaze one last time. "No, Karen. You made it fearful. There's a difference." For the first time since she'd moved into Pinewood Estates, the boardroom felt lighter. The tension that had once lived in its walls began to dissolve. One by one, board members began collecting their things, muttering quiet apologies or words of support to Miriam as they passed. Even the residents who had once cowered under Karen's strict watch now looked at her with something close to pity. She slumped in her chair, staring blankly at the empty table as if her kingdom had vanished overnight. As the meeting concluded, Miriam gathered her papers, her tone gentle but resolute. "I'll work with the board to ensure fair conduct moving forward. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home." She turned to leave, David by her side, when Karen's voice, small, trembling, almost childlike, broke through the silence. "Why didn't you just tell me who you were from the start?" Miriam paused at the doorway, glancing back only once. "Because respect shouldn't depend on titles," she said softly. "It should depend on how we treat one another." And with that, she stepped into the morning light, leaving Karen in a hall that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, and too empty. Outside, David slipped his hand into hers. "Do you think she'll change?" he asked. Miriam sighed, watching the neighborhood bathed in sunlight, the same streets that had once felt hostile now calm and still. "Maybe," she said. "But even if she doesn't, the rest of them will. That's enough." The faint sound of wind rustled through the oaks as the two walked home, the storm that had shaken Pinewood Estates finally breaking into peace. The following weeks in Pinewood Estates carried a strange quiet that no one had experienced before. It wasn't the usual suburban calm, it was the kind that comes after a long storm, when the wind has finally died but the trees still sway from the memory of it. The HOA bulletin board, once plastered with Karen Whitmore's notices and threats about violations, fine warnings, and mandatory paint color compliance, now stood half empty, the only paper pinned to it being a simple typed memo: "Interim HOA leadership elections will be held next month. All residents welcome." There were no capitalized threats, no underlined demands. Just information, plain, peaceful, and fair. The neighborhood, once suffocating under Karen's iron control, was beginning to breathe again. Karen's downfall hadn't been explosive, it was slow, quiet, and inevitable. After the revelation of her misuse of authority and the county's investigation, she had tried to cling to what little power she had left, but even her most loyal board members distanced themselves. The audit revealed she had used HOA funds for administrative expenses that led straight to her personal credit card. The county froze the account. Her SUV, the same one she used to patrol the neighborhood like a warden, was repossessed. The neighbors who once feared her now passed her house without lowering their eyes. Curtains that used to twitch with anxiety now stayed open, letting in sunlight. Karen, once the self-proclaimed guardian of Pinewood Estates, had become its ghost. On a crisp Saturday morning, Judge Miriam Blackwood stood at her front porch, pruning the roses that had grown in fuller than ever. The community had changed since her arrival, not because she imposed authority, but because she restored balance. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years now shared coffee on porches. Children played freely on the sidewalks without worrying about receiving warning letters for disturbing the peace. The air was lighter, conversations friendlier, and for the first time, Pinewood felt like a neighborhood, not a kingdom. David stepped out beside her, handing her a mug of tea. "You've started something here," he said, looking out at the street where residents were planting flowers along the median strip, something the old HOA would have fined them for. Miriam smiled faintly. "They just needed permission to be human again," she said. But even in peace, there were echoes of the past. One afternoon, Miriam received an envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single piece of stationery, embossed with pink trim, and a short handwritten note: "I'm sorry. You were right. I forgot what community meant." It wasn't signed, but the careful, looping handwriting was unmistakable. Miriam stood in silence for a long moment, reading it twice before setting it down. "Karen," she whispered softly, almost sadly. There was no satisfaction in the words, only reflection. Power, after all, was a fragile thing, and Karen had simply let it consume her. That was punishment enough. Miriam didn't need to ruin her. Life would handle that on its own. The HOA board reformed under new leadership within the month. A kind, practical man named Tom was elected president. His first official act was to rewrite the charter to make it transparent and accessible. No more ambiguous clauses or personal loopholes. Every homeowner would receive a digital copy, and all votes would be held publicly. He also formed a community outreach committee, encouraging residents to collaborate on neighborhood improvements instead of competing over who followed the rules best. For the first time, people smiled at HOA meetings. They brought baked goods, shared stories, and actually laughed. The hall that once echoed with Karen's clipped commands now buzzed with warmth and conversation. Miriam attended one of those meetings quietly, sitting near the back, watching the transformation unfold. She wasn't the center of attention. She never wanted to be. When Tom thanked her for restoring order through fairness, she shook her head. "You all restored it," she said. "You just needed to remember what fairness looked like." She left early that evening, walking home beneath the glow of the streetlights. Pinewood Estates looked different now, the lawns not perfectly trimmed but alive with character, the fences varied in color, the flower beds blooming in untamed beauty. It wasn't uniform anymore, but it was real. As she turned the corner toward her home, Miriam saw Karen's house across the street, its once pristine hedges now slightly overgrown, the HOA President plaque gone from the mailbox. Through the window, she glimpsed Karen sitting at a table, alone, a stack of papers and a single cup of coffee before her. No SUV, no clipboard, no army of board members at her back. Just a woman who had built her life around control and now had nothing left to control. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the glass. Karen didn't look angry, just tired. She gave a small nod, one that Miriam returned with quiet grace before walking on. No words were exchanged. None were needed. That night, as the cool wind rustled through the trees, Miriam sat on her porch beside David, both watching the street fade into the soft haze of evening. "Do you think she'll stay?" David asked after a long pause. Miriam took a sip of her tea, her gaze steady. "Maybe. Maybe not. But even if she leaves, what matters is that the people who stay have learned something." She smiled faintly. Rules can keep order, but respect keeps peace. David nodded, reaching for her hand as crickets began their nightly chorus. In the months that followed, Pinewood Estates became almost unrecognizable compared to the neighborhood Miriam had first moved into. The HOA hosted outdoor movie nights, community cleanups, and even a small summer fair where children sold lemonade beside gardeners showing off homegrown produce. There were still rules, but now they protected, not punished. Homeowners painted their fences, hung fairy lights, built benches under oak trees, and no one received a single fine for it. What had once been a rigid community of fear had evolved into one of pride and connection. And though Miriam never took credit for the change, everyone knew it had started with her, the quiet woman who refused to be intimidated, who faced arrogance with law and cruelty with calm. She didn't just defeat an HOA tyrant, she reminded an entire community what integrity looked like. Late one evening, after another long day in court, Miriam stood by her window, watching the lights of Pinewood Estates twinkle against the dusk. Somewhere down the street, laughter echoed, real, unguarded laughter. She smiled, whispering to herself, order restored.